The early morning at the airport was alive with energy. The sound of the loudspeakers echoed through the terminal, creating a rhythm that blended seamlessly with the rush of travelers. People streamed toward the security checkpoints, their movements creating a lively, chaotic scene. Among the crowd, there was one figure who seemed to move through the noise unnoticed. An elderly woman, probably in her 70s, who quietly made her way past the bustling passengers. She was small in stature, her frail body wrapped in a faded, worn-out sari, its soft folds hinting at the passage of time. The fabric clung to her thin frame, while an old cloth bag hung from her shoulder, weathered and worn but still holding together. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, and her steps were slow, yet there was a quiet strength in her presence, an aura of calm that contrasted sharply with the hurried movements of those around her. She seemed to be in a world of her own, unhurried and disconnected from the chaos surrounding her. The flight she was about to board was not just any journey. For her, it was more than a simple trip. It was the culmination of a lifetime of memories, decisions, and sacrifices. It was a link between her past and the present, a journey that would take her back to the moments and people who shaped her life, to the experiences that defined her existence. This wasn't a simple getaway. It was a chance to connect with the dreams she had helped to build, with the world she had quietly and tirelessly worked to create. As she approached the check-in counter, her hands trembled slightly as she handed over her business class ticket, a small gesture that drew a curious glance from the staff. The young attendant, a bit surprised by the contrast between the woman's appearance and her ticket, quickly processed the information without comment. The old woman nodded in acknowledgement, the brief exchange marked by an unspoken understanding. She continued her journey through the airport, the ticket still tightly clutched in her hands, a reminder of the special nature of this trip. This business class ticket was not a symbol of wealth or indulgence. It wasn't something she had longed for all her life. She had lived simply, always putting others first, prioritizing the needs of her family and community over her own desires. But today, after so many years of selflessness, she had decided to allow herself this one luxury, a moment to step into a world she had once helped to shape, a world she had contributed to with all her heart. As she moved through the terminal, her eyes sparkled with an emotion that was hard to describe. It wasn't just excitement. It was a flood of memories, of dreams long past, of sacrifices made, of moments that had shaped her journey. She thought back to her younger days, the long nights spent planning, the dreams she had worked so hard to bring to life, the moments of heartbreak when she had to part with the most precious things in her life. But despite the challenges, she had never faltered. Her steps, though small, were steady and resolute as she approached the plane. The wind gently lifted the edges of her sari as she stood at the foot of the stairs leading to the plane. The scene felt almost like a painting, a quiet moment of strength amid the hustle of the airport. Little did anyone know, the woman making her way onto the plane had changed the lives of countless people, and this flight would become a chapter in a story that would be remembered for years to come. As she ascended the steps, her hand gently held the business class ticket, a symbol of everything she had given, everything she had built. This was not just a flight. It was the return of a person who had been behind the scenes, working tirelessly to make a difference, without ever seeking recognition. She wasn't just traveling from one place to another. She was embarking on a journey to reflect on her past, to confront what she had left behind, to revisit the legacy she had created. But she had no idea that this journey would bring more than just nostalgia. It would bring a series of unexpected events, intense emotions, and a moment that would change how people saw her forever. When she stepped into the business class cabin, her presence seemed to disturb the perfect harmony of the luxurious space. The soft lighting from the overhead lamps highlighted the plush leather seats, the small tables with their gleaming glasses of wine, the subtle scent of expensive perfumes in the air. Everything in the cabin screamed luxury, sophistication, and exclusivity, but in the midst of all this opulence, The elderly woman seemed out of place. Her worn sari, her weathered handbag, and her small, fragile frame stood in stark contrast to the lavish surroundings. The change in atmosphere was immediate. A man in a tailored suit raised his eyebrows, his expression shifting from curiosity to judgment. A young woman, her appearance immaculate, glanced at the old woman, her gaze laced with confusion and curiosity. Whispers began to ripple through the cabin, small murmurs that reached the woman's ears. "What is she doing here?" someone muttered. The looks and whispers stung, sharper than she cared to admit. She had encountered judgment throughout her life, but in this space, it felt more intense, more piercing. Still, she kept walking, her steps steady, though each one carried the weight of her memories, her sacrifices, and the mocking glances of those around her. She had faced similar looks before, but here, in this setting, they felt like knives aimed directly at her heart. The whispers grew louder, and some passengers began to show their disdain more openly. A man turned his face away as if he couldn't bear to sit near her. A woman in a chic dress smirked, then whispered something to her neighbor. The soft laughter and disapproving gestures cut through the air, but the old woman remained unshaken. She held her head high, her eyes fixed straight ahead, her hands still tightly clutching the old handbag that had been with her through all these years. There was no anger in her eyes, no bitterness, just quiet determination. She had walked through life being misunderstood, judged by appearances, but never letting it stop her. As she passed a reflective window, she caught a glimpse of herself, an old small woman out of place in this glamorous setting. But then, a sense of clarity washed over her. She was here for a reason. This journey wasn't about the glances, the whispers, or the judgment. It was about something deeper, something that had brought her here, and nothing would take that from her. Before she could settle into her seat, a cold voice broke through her thoughts. "Madam, this is business class. Economy is at the back. Please return to your seat." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting, silencing the cabin. The woman turned slowly, facing the young flight attendant whose expression was filled with disdain. The confrontation had begun. The scene unfolded like a dramatic clash between two worlds, two starkly different perspectives. One was rooted in the glitzy superficiality of appearances, the other in the quiet depth of true worth hidden beneath simplicity. The moment of reckoning was rapidly approaching, yet what no one anticipated was the way the truth would turn the tables, shattering every initial assumption. An elderly woman, poised and dignified, walked towards the row of seats marked on her ticket. Her gaze swept across the cabin, leaving no trace, but her serene presence became the focal point of attention. A ripple of whispers spread through the business class section, eyes narrowed in judgment. Some passengers lowered their heads and exchanged hushed comments, their words filled with doubt and mockery. The stillness in the air was pierced by the sharp voice of a young flight attendant, her tone cutting through the tension. "Madam, this is business class. Economy class is further back. Please return to your seat." Every eye in the cabin was drawn to the interaction, the tension thickening as the stewardess, with her polished and professional demeanor, stood at attention. Her uniform was immaculate, her stance commanding, but her eyes betrayed a clear disdain as they lingered on the old woman before her. The elderly lady's hands tightened slightly around the small, worn bag on her shoulder, but her expression remained unshaken, her eyes as gentle as ever. Without uttering a word, the old woman pulled out her ticket and handed it to the stewardess, who looked at it, then up at her, confusion flickering across her face. The ticket was clearly marked for business class. The stewardess hesitated, the frown on her face deepening. But in an instant she recovered her composure, her voice now tinged with incredulity. "Are you sure this ticket is yours?" Her gaze swept over the woman's worn clothes. Her tone pointed, as if to emphasize the disparity between the elderly lady's appearance and the luxury of the space. "This outfit," she continued, raising her voice deliberately, "doesn't quite fit the setting." A few passengers caught the edge of her words and reacted with a mix of surprise and amusement. The cabin filled with murmurs, some mocking, others unsure how to react. A middle-aged man let out a derisive snort, his eyes full of mockery. A young woman sitting by the window whispered something to her companion, both of them bursting into laughter. The atmosphere grew heavier, thick with the tension of expectation. It was as if everyone was waiting for a reaction, for the old woman to defend herself. But she didn't flinch. She stood there, quiet and composed, holding the ticket firmly in her hands, her gaze never wavering. Her silence seemed to amplify the tension, drawing more scrutiny, but still, she said nothing. The stewardess's patience seemed to fray, her voice turning even colder as she spoke more sharply. "Do you understand what I'm saying? This isn't a place for someone like you." Her words cut through the air, loud enough for everyone to hear, and the cabin responded with a chorus of hushed laughter and whispered comments. An elderly man in the back corner of the room cleared his throat, a thin smile of ridicule playing on his lips. The voices grew louder, the weight of their judgments pressing in from all sides. Still, the old woman remained unmoved. Her hands tightened around the ticket, her eyes locked in calm resolve. Her silence was thick with something deeper, perhaps regret or sorrow, but it was difficult to tell. There was a sadness in her eyes, almost imperceptible, like a fleeting shadow. She held on to the ticket as if it were a lifeline, a piece of truth that she couldn't afford to lose. The room seemed to grow heavier in the stillness of her presence, the weight of silent judgment hanging in the air. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, a voice broke the silence. A deep, authoritative voice that commanded attention. "Stop right there." The entire cabin froze. The murmurs ceased, and all eyes turned toward the source of the command. It was a tall man, middle-aged with gray hair, wearing a sharp suit that radiated authority. As he rose from the front row, his presence seemed to fill the space. His gaze pierced the flight attendant as he approached, his voice calm yet carrying the unmistakable weight of power. "Do you know who she is?" he asked, each word cutting through the tension like a knife. The stewardess faltered, her face paling as her hands instinctively clutched the file in front of her. I was just doing my duty." But the man wasn't interested in her explanation. He stepped closer, his eyes locking with hers. "She is the founder of this airline," he said, his voice unwavering. "She dedicated her life to building this company. Without her, you wouldn't even have this job." A stunned silence overtook the cabin. The atmosphere shifted, as murmurs of disbelief replaced the earlier laughter. Passengers who had once sneered at the old woman now looked on in shock, their expressions shifting from mockery to confusion. Some lowered their heads in a mixture of shame and respect. The man turned to the rest of the passengers, his voice warm yet filled with reverence. "If we're sitting here today, enjoying the comfort and safety of this flight, it's because of her. She built this airline not for personal gain, but for the benefit of all of us." For a moment, the entire cabin was still, the only sound the soft hum of the engine. The old woman stood there, her expression unchanged. Her eyes, however, held a quiet strength, and a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of her lips. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but of quiet resilience, of enduring dignity. Her silence, in that moment, held more power than any words could have. As the room absorbed the gravity of the situation, the mocking glances melted away, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The air had thickened, and the once confident passengers now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A woman seated nearby whispered to her companion, "Who is she? Why does she seem so calm?" Then, with a soft creak, a chair shifted as a tall man in a tailored suit stood up and walked toward the old woman. His face was stern, and each step seemed to echo in the hushed cabin. As he reached the flight attendant, his gaze was cold, and without a word, he passed her by, moving toward the elderly woman. Stopping in front of her, the man bowed deeply, his voice soft, yet filled with profound respect. "Madam," he said, "I apologize for what has happened. I'm afraid they didn't know who you are." The words spoken by the elderly woman had an almost magical effect, sparking something in the air. It was as if her words set fire to a pile of dry straw, igniting a chain reaction of curiosity in the passengers. The atmosphere shifted, and all eyes in the cabin were fixed on her. The question on everyone's mind was the same. Who is this woman who could command such respect from someone who seemed so powerful? The old woman gave a soft, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't just a friendly gesture. It was a smile full of wisdom, the kind that carried with it the weight of years spent learning the values of tolerance and forgiveness. Her smile seemed to wipe away all the judgment, awkwardness, and regret that had been hanging in the air moments earlier. She gently placed her hand on the man's shoulder, a quiet but meaningful gesture that seemed to say that none of what had just occurred was worth holding on to. Her voice, soft yet clear, carried the weight of a life's worth of lessons. "It's okay," she said, her words filled with an understanding that touched everyone present. We live in a world where people often judge by appearances. It's unfortunate, yes, but it's also natural. I'm not angry. I don't blame anyone. But I do hope that today, all of us can learn to look beyond what we see on the surface. We should look at what a person has truly contributed to this world and how they treat others, not just what they wear. Her words were not directed solely at the flight attendant or the man who had been so quick to judge. No, they were for everyone in the business class cabin, for everyone who had been part of the moment. Her words flowed like a cool breeze, dispelling the tension in the cabin and replacing it with a sense of calm and clarity. Slowly, apologies began to fill the space. One by one, the passengers who had been judgmental, or who had merely been silent observers, began to stand up. A young woman who had been holding her phone, ready to record the entire incident, quietly put it away. Her face flushed with shame, and with a voice barely above a whisper, she bowed her head to the old woman and said, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have judged you. I'm truly grateful for everything you've done." A middle-aged man dressed in a neat suit walked forward, his face full of remorse. His hands were clasped in front of him, a sign of respect. With his head bowed, he spoke, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm sorry for judging you. Thank you. Thank you for everything you've done for all of us. I don't know what else to say except my sincerest thanks." The young flight attendant, unable to contain her emotions, approached the woman slowly, tears already starting to form in her eyes. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. I never thought I could be this wrong. I promise I will never judge anyone like that again. Thank you for everything." With those words, the flight attendant began to cry, and her sobs filled the cabin, echoing through the quiet space as a powerful reminder of the lesson the old woman had just imparted. The old woman continued to smile, her eyes soft with warmth and forgiveness. There was no anger, no reproach in her gaze. Instead, she nodded gently, as if to tell the young attendant that all was forgiven. Then, placing her hand on the flight attendant's shoulder, she spoke softly, "You don't need to cry. We all make mistakes. What matters is that we recognize where we went wrong and are willing to change. I'm not angry. I'm happy that you have the courage to admit your mistakes. That's all that matters." Her words, filled with grace, touched the flight attendant deeply. But this time her tears were not just of regret. They were tears of gratitude, for the woman had not only forgiven her, but had also helped her grow. Soon, others in the cabin, unable to hold back their emotions, stood up and walked over to the old woman. The atmosphere, once filled with judgment and disdain, had transformed into one of respect and gratitude. One by one, passengers approached the elderly woman to apologize, to express their admiration. The airline's general director, who had been standing quietly beside her, gave a deep bow and said, "Madam, we owe you everything. Thank you for everything you've done for this airline and for all of us." We will never forget today's lesson." The old woman nodded with satisfaction. "I hope that this lesson stays with you," she said, "not only in your work, but in how you live your lives. A good leader knows how to manage, but the best leaders know how to inspire others to spread the right values." As the plane landed, there was a round of applause, but it wasn't for the smooth landing. It was for the elderly woman. As she slowly made her way down the aisle, her small figure exuded a quiet strength, a certain dignity. The passengers, who had once scrutinized and mocked her, now stood to give her space. They bowed, and some even spoke the words they hadn't dared to say earlier. "Thank you for everything. I'm sorry for not recognizing your worth sooner." The old woman smiled gently and nodded, but said nothing more. As she walked off the plane, her faded attire, which had once seemed so out of place in the world of luxury, had become a symbol of resilience, simplicity, and the values she had lived her life by. Her story, though it ended as she left the plane, had already begun to spread. It wasn't just a story of respect. It was a reminder that the true worth of a person is not in what they wear, but in what they've done, in their heart, and in the legacy they leave behind. The passengers would never forget her, and neither would anyone who heard her story.